Welcome to Life Science Marketing Radio, the podcast where marketing leaders inside and outside the sciences share their creative ideas and practical approaches to increasing your marketing ROI. Here's your host, Chris Connor.
Annalise Ludtke is the Senior Manager for Marketing Communications and Strategy at Vodori, also the host of the Amend and Progress podcast. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this episode. Annalise, welcome to episode 204 of Life Science Marketing Radio.
Chris, delighted to be here and delighted to be guest number 204.
I never shout out the number, but I'm feeling perky today. I got to let somebody know.
I love it. It's an amazing milestone. Everything should be celebrated.
Yeah. All right. So just for context, tell us about Vodori, what you guys are up to, the problems you guys are trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm Senior Manager of Marketing and Communications at Vodori. Vodori is a software company that provides best-in-class content management software for life science organizations. So essentially, the issue we're trying to solve is the review, approval, and distribution of content, making that easier, faster, and more compliant for life science organizations. So, the issue is simple. A lot of all life science organizations need to develop advertising and promotional content. Reviewing, approving, and distributing that content is really difficult. And that's for a variety of reasons, right? It's taking a long time. It's hard to corral all of the necessary people that need to review and approve that content. Then you've got capital C compliance sort of as the underbelly to all of this. And so content review, I will say it's called content review, MLR review, promotional review. We hear a whole host of different terms. So I'll use those throughout the conversation today. But, it really is oftentimes kind of referred to as this necessary evil. Within life science organizations, you have to do it, but it's not fun, it's not great, and it's kind of hard. And so Vodori's mission is really to make this a little bit easier and simpler for life science organizations while providing them with peace of mind that they're doing it in a compliant way. And so really the goal for us is better, faster, more compliant processes that lead to better outcomes. And when we talk about outcomes, that's, better outcomes for the individual, that's better outcomes for the team, for the organization, and ultimately for the patient population that you're developing your drugs and devices for.
Nice. Yes. Content should be fun.
Content is so necessary.
About the hard parts, but
yeah,
it's fun to make content, and then it's like, oh, we're hitting the brakes. And
well, let's be honest, you have to create content. It's necessary in today's digital marketing world, and certainly for life science organizations that are pursuing these, omni-channel strategies, you have to create content. But in order to publish that content, it has to go through review and approval. And so that's why I think it's often referred to as this necessary evil process, because you have to do it. It's not great, but at the end of the day, how are you going to, get your products to market if you don't have content to support that?
Right. So we're going to talk about, kind of just best practices around this to make it easy for people. So just because I know every company has different processes, but give an overview of the kinds of things that have to happen between marketing content being created and then in the review process, and then all the way to something that I don't think about as part of a review thing, but distribution, right? Where's it going to go and how do you get it there?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of the listeners may be familiar with this type of process. As you indicated, it does look a little bit different at every life science organization, but let's think about the people that are involved, right? So you've got your brand managers within life science organizations. They're responsible for sort of the commercial strategy and the content creation. You potentially have agencies that are creating the content for you, creating the videos, the websites, the things. Maybe they're in another city. They're remote. You're remote. So you got sort of these different stakeholders going on. Then you have the reviewers, right? And depending on your organization, your medical, legal, and regulatory reviewer might be in-house. They might be part of your team. You might be outsourcing that review to someone else just because you're not reviewing content that often, just the makeup of your team. And so you've got time zones, you've got agendas, you've got different people, different priorities. There's a lot going on here. And I think oftentimes it's a good reminder to say, MLR reviewers, this is not their full-time job. This is a component of their job. And so you can start to imagine how a lot of different priorities are creeping up in terms of, I need this content approved. Well, yeah, but I've got 10 other things on my list for today. So typically what the process looks like is, you've got content ready for approval. You submit it to those, the agency or the brand manager submits it to those various departments for review. Now the content needs to be of high quality. The content needs to be substantiated with claims or supporting materials that are backing up the claims being made in the content, right? If you're making a content about, our drug reduces heart disease by 65%, whatever the case may be, you need a claim or substantiation to back that up. And then it goes into review. And essentially all these reviewers will review the content and provide feedback on, can we say this? Are we being truthful, non-misleading? Is this on brand? Is this the right wording choice? So the content goes through review. And this is where I think the bulk of the time and potentially frustration comes out, right? Because you're just dealing with a lot of feedback on content. And then it's up to that sort of brand owner or content owner to then take any feedback that was provided, make edits or revisions, and submit it again. And at Vodori, we know from just pulling our own benchmarking data, it takes about 1.5 circulations of content to get approved. And so you might be going through this once, you might be going through it several times. But that's typically what this looks like. And I think there's a lot of different reasons, best practices that we could talk about that make that process easier, but that's generally how it goes, obviously with some nuances or differences depending on your organization and the makeup of your team.
Yeah. So the first question that comes to my mind as you're talking about that is there a best practice, or is there a way that people are typically doing it that may not be the best practice? And that is, does it go to medical, legal, and regulatory in parallel? Or is there a sequence? What does that look like? What have you seen?
Yep. So this is one of the areas where it's going to be dependent on the standard operating procedures at your organization. At Vodori, we see our customers do either parallel review, where the content is submitted to all of those departments at the same time. The advantage there is that you can kind of see what type of feedback is coming in. There can be some dialogue around feedback. Those reviewers are sort of like in it together, and it's a more collaborative, maybe one-step review process. Others prefer to do like a sequential. So it does go to one, maybe it goes to medical first, then it goes to the other department. So kind of depends on a lot of different factors at your organization, but those are both possible, sort of like review formats that we see at Vodori. We tend to encourage parallel review because of that open dialogue and communication that can happen. But again, both are possible and there are advantages to both.
Well, that's helpful, because I might have thought it was more difficult in some ways to go parallel, because if they're not communicating, then you get conflicting feedback on parts of it, and that you end up having to resolve. But maybe they can resolve it between themselves before it gets back to you. Is that a possibility?
That's the hope. And certainly the content owner plays a role here too, or the person that's sort of watching what's going on during the review process. If there are open questions, it is often helpful to have someone, paying attention and saying like, no, this thread is open. We need to resolve this before it comes back to me for any feedback consolidation. So I think that open dialogue is really based on, I talk to all sorts of experts in this space, both within and outside Vodori, about sort of these process best practices. And I do think dialogue and communication is coming up very often as like, communicate with one another, talk to one another. If you're in a review and there's a discrepancy or a disagreement, maybe that's something that you bring into a meeting, or you hop on a Zoom call, or, you talk face to face. I think so often we forget that we're all individuals and we're all different people. And sometimes communication is a really good solve to working out any of those discrepancies or disagreements that are happening during review. And so I think that's just like a good general best practice, is like, don't forget to talk to one another and communicate and find the right formats and modalities for that communication that work for your organization.
Right. But it sounds like, not to lean too hard on pitching your product, but I'm going to now, because okay. The fact that you mentioned like that, I can see what people are doing. That's a different thing than, my old days experience sending around a PDF and getting marked.
Totally.
Right?
Yes.
So being able to watch it as it's happening, allows you to maybe just get on the phone real quick and say, hey, can we fix this one thing? Done.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. Yes, the Vodori platform does enable real-time review. So you can literally be in the document reviewing and dropping annotations at the same time as another person. And so you can imagine some of the advantages you get from that in just what you said. We can literally be going back and forth in edits in real time. If it needs to be escalated for another reason, then, we can sort of pursue that as well. But yep, you can all be in there at the same time, seeing what other people are providing feedback around. And that just helps create some clarity around the process, and just improve sort of that inter-team communication. So you can imagine some of the advantages there of, I know that Susie Marketing is also in this document. We're sort of going back and forth on comments. Oh, we disagree. We need to pick this up in a meeting or a Zoom to resolve. And so that is one of the advantages, is just like that clarity around communication and understanding the types of comments that your colleagues are dropping can be hugely helpful for agreeing on if the content needs to come back for review, for example, but also providing really good comments and clear comments for the content owner, right? You can imagine that one of the pain points here is there are 17 comments in this document. I'm not sure which ones are mandatory. I'm not sure which ones are suggested.
That was my next question. Yeah.
Is this a question? Like, what do I do? And so I think, another advantage of sort of that real-time review is being able to work together to resolve any of those disagreements or discrepancies so that it is super clear what the content owner needs to do for the next circulation or to incorporate any feedback.
Yeah, I like that you call that out, and maybe people think about when they make comments, this must happen, or it would be nice if this happened.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's honestly an easy best practice that organizations can think about, either through color coding, which you can do in Vodori's platform, or even just putting before your comment, suggested. This is a comment that I'm suggesting, but it's not necessary in this next round of review. Literally just indicating suggested versus mandatory, we've seen go a really long way in providing clarity to the content owner on what needs to happen in that next round of review. So it's like one of those really small best practices, but again, it's like focused on communication, it's focused on clarity, and we see it really generate some great outcomes in terms of helping reduce those cycle times, because you better understand the types of edits you definitely need to make with your agency or someone else on your team for, the next round of approval.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's a simple thing that will make this whole thing, which no one really wants to do, like, let's remove some friction with a single word.
A single word. That's exactly it. Yep, just the small stuff can really go a long way.
All right, so since you mentioned best practices, hit me with some more, because I'm sure you've got a pocket full of them.
Yeah, and this is one of the fun parts of my job as being the host of the Amend and Progress podcast at Vodori, is that I get to ask everyone all the time about their best practices. So, the big caveat I'll say here is best practices are going to depend on your organization. Not every best practice is going to be for every organization, but let me talk about some of the maybe like bigger ones that we see be really advantageous no matter the type of segment that you're in or your team size, et cetera. So one is roles and responsibilities. Document the roles and responsibilities of the people on your review team. What is their review purview? What should they be focused on when the content gets into review? One of the challenges we see sometimes happen is reviewers leaving comments that are maybe a little bit outside of their lane or their purview, right? And that can create a lot of friction, that can create some disagreement. And so by simply documenting roles and responsibilities in your standard operating procedures, having awareness of that and communicating that to your review team can be really, really helpful as just level setting, baseline, foundational best practice to take into account. Another sort of baseline foundational best practice we talk about a lot is goal setting. The MLR process is not a box that you can check off. It is not like we have great MLR, we have a great MLR process, we're done. This is how it's going to go. Like it's a living, breathing thing. Your team is going to change, your organization is going to change, your commercial priorities are going to change. And so the review process is sort of this like ever changing, ever living thing. And we're often talking to customers about how to improve it, either because they want to be faster at it, they want to have better compliance, they want to reduce their cycle time. There's a whole host of reasons of ways that you can sort of improve the process, but without knowing your goals, without like establishing goals for your process and measuring those, it's really hard to iterate and improve, right? So think about what the goals are for your process. Again, document those, communicate those to the team often. And not only is that helpful for just ongoing iteration and improvement of your process, but it's also just good level setting for the team, right? It's good communication to say, hey, this is the goal that we're all working to achieve together as part of this process. It's good alignment. It's good vision setting for the team. There's a lot of like great collaboration outcomes that can come from goal setting, in addition to sort of the improvement and iteration things that I mentioned.
Yeah, I love goals. So I want to ask, when you set a goal for better compliance, because as someone who doesn't necessarily live in that world on the compliance side so much, what does that look like? How do you, because I'm assuming everything that goes out is compliant unless, something came back from a higher power that said
Sure.
no, right?
Sure.
Or, yeah, I get. Well, tell me what the goal could be. I'm imagining, obviously with lots of legal things, there's how much risk will we accept? Not to say we can be this careless, but
Yeah. I think there's a lot. So I wish I had a compliance expert that I could ask here to like give me a goal for you. But what I would say is, there could be goals around that we're going to review and approve all of the promotional claims that we're going to be making in advance, so that we know that like claims that we're making in our materials are substantiated, and that we don't have to. That is one way that we're going to reduce our risk as an organization, is that everyone agrees that these are the claims that we can make in the promotional material. So a small thing, but claims management comes up a lot as both a compliance sort of issue, but also just like a review issue of, let's say you put a piece of content through the review process, you've got a claim in there, but nobody's seen it before. How is that being substantiated? Where are the references to back that up? I don't really like that wording. Are we sure that's what we can say? And so pre-aligning on some of that language, some of that claims language, and having like a claims library established in advance can be incredibly helpful, as you can imagine. Then when the content goes through review, say, hey team, this claim we approved already. One less thing for you to look at, right? We already have alignment there. Take a look at the rest of the content and make sure that the claim, makes sense within the context of the rest of the content, et cetera. So that could be one thing that you're setting goals around, is maybe how you establish your claims, review them, maintain them, things of that nature. But to your point, each organization is going to have various risk tolerance. And so it's kind of up to them to decide the types of goals that they're going to want to set around compliance.
yeah, that's, I like having a claims library. I can still imagine like, we're going to say it a little differently next time, and then now we might have to think
Right.
about it. But if you're smart and creative, maybe you can write something that's universally applicable and paste it in.
Exactly. And another advantage of, having a claims library is sometimes you can have a variation of a claim. This is the primary claim. This is usually how we word it. There are a couple other ways that we can use it. And having just like that connectivity between those claims and all the reference information, you can imagine just ton of clarity, ton of peace of mind that like this has been looked at. We've talked about this. This is the right thing, and we're going to say it at the right time. And, I'll make a plug for the Vodori platform. We do have a claims library feature or capability where you can review and approve individual claims and then link those claims within your promotional materials. But you can also pull a list of every piece of content that's using that claim. Claims change. Your research is going to change. The backup data that's going to support those claims are going to change. So if you need to make a modification to one of the claims you've already approved, let me pull a list of all the documents we're using this claim in today. Okay, now I know what I might need to go revisit or re-review and approve to make sure that content is compliant. So we've seen that be incredibly helpful just in the workflows and making sure that the content that's out there with your sales reps and your MSLs is not out of date. You have complete clarity over what content is being used, what claims are being used within that content, and what would I potentially need to update.
Yeah, I mean, I might not have even thought of that, but like when data changes, hopefully for the better,
Exactly.
and then you think, where can we update a claim? Or on the dark side of that, like something, how do we find all the things where we said that thing we're not allowed to say anymore?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a big, especially it means some for organizations that are releasing a high volume of content that could be tens of 20s of 30s of, numbers of documents that would need approval, re-review and approval. And so it just helps that sort of brand, that marketer, that commercial person understand, okay, we need to pull this stuff back and re-review it to make sure we are compliant. It's a hugely helpful peace of mind giver for the organization, just to make sure that everything in use is compliant.
So we talked a little bit about collaboration already and communication, how important that is, but maybe we can talk about what best practices are around ownership of I'm assuming the creator of the document to some degree, but who owns the process? Who kind of manages it?
Yeah,
what do you see?
This varies as well. Typically, we see either the commercial folks own the review process or medical. Depends on the organization and the makeup of your team. That's typically who we see own the process. Now, within those teams, there's going to be potentially various people submitting content for review. There could also be agencies submitting content for review on your behalf. It just kind of depends on how your organization works and who you're working with. When it comes to sort of like collaboration best practices, I think one thing I really encourage people to think about, and I have this conversation with people all the time on the podcast, is this process does not exist without human beings. You literally can't have content review without human beings. And so if you forget about the humans and you don't think about how the team is working together, how they are collaborating, how they are communicating, I think you're missing a lot of opportunity to make this process run better, faster, smoother, more compliant. And so there are a ton of different ways, right, to think about how to improve collaboration within your team. A couple of things I'll throw out that you can think about. One is sort of at the macro level of communicate the why. Either the why behind how your process is being run or the why behind the piece of content. And we can see this happen in a lot of different ways. And this is sort of hearkening back to what I talked about in terms of like alignment and just getting your team on the same page. One thing we see happen sometimes is that commercial marketing will submit a web page, something for review. Gets to the reviewers and they're like, I don't really like this. I don't like how it's positioned. Did we talk about this? What about XYZ? And so creating more of a concept review can be really helpful. And this is especially helpful if you're like developing content you've never developed before or it's something new. Getting a concept in front of your reviewers in advance and enabling more of that collaboration to say, what do you think? Medical, legal, regulatory, can we make these types of claims? What feedback do you have? Incorporate them more into the content creation process can be really helpful up front, because then you sort of have this pre-alignment. That way, when the content is developed and you are submitting it for review, everyone kind of has a sense of like what this should look like, what we talked about, and the why, the purpose, the target audience for this piece of content. So it's another step, but it is really helpful in reducing the ultimate amount of time that you're going to be reviewing and approving the content, because people know what to expect and there's been some pre-alignment there. So we've seen that be really successful within organizations. About half of our customers continue to use review meetings. So this is an opportunity for that review team to come together at a predetermined time and think and talk about content in review. A ton of different best practices within review meetings, but depends on your organization if you want to use them or not. They're not necessary, but they can be really helpful in working through any of those disagreements, like we talked about, answering open questions during pieces of content, but it also just creates a space and time for your team to engage in dialogue, talk to one another. We're having a disagreement, let's talk through that in real time. You can often achieve consensus or reach a decision faster in person than you could potentially going back and forth, in a review document. And so we see review meetings still being used pretty strategically by our customers just to advance the review process, to talk through stickier content, and just to create, like I said, a good communication format for the team.
Yeah, I like both of those things. One, essentially giving a brief to the review team, so we agree what we're trying to make and they're not asking unnecessary questions when it shows up. And the second one, because my memory will fail me already, but meeting together and having a process, maybe to review a bunch of pieces of content, because going back and forth, I mean, there's a cost every time you have to open a document, right? That's like,
Absolutely.
and remember what you were talking about. So, and nothing is more expensive than moving backwards. So, like,
Absolutely. And I think sometimes, especially if we're in remote environments, we kind of forget that, like, oh, I can, like, talk, it's not the same sometimes, but like remembering the value of real-time dialogue, I think is like something we often encourage folks to think about. Is it just easier, better, faster to get on and talk through something in a review meeting or else, otherwise? And while that real-time review within the platform is super helpful, sometimes there are just bigger things you have to talk through. It's just the nature of the industry. It's the nature of human beings. Not everything is going to be solved in a super simple way. And so think about, what are the different times and places you can bring the team together to work through those stickier, hairier things.
As a person who doesn't really like meetings at all, I endorse this process.
Okay, great. I'm happy to hear that.
I've spent a lot of time in meetings. And I thought, I've probably mentioned it on this podcast before. I used to have a meeting with my manager and all my peers, half of which would go into my meeting with my team to relay the message. And why don't we just all get in the room and talk about that stuff? Anyway, that's another podcast. Let's talk about benchmarks. How do I know if my team is superior to everybody else in the industry or I'm lagging?
Yeah. So, hopefully in some of what I've talked about today, I've convinced you that the content review process is hard, it's fluid, but it's important. And so obviously, there's sort of this, it's not my mantra, it's someone else came up with this concept of like what gets measured gets managed. And so, Chris, what are things that you measure in your personal life? Could be steps, could be your 401k. If you don't know what the benchmark is or what you're striving for or what you should be comparing yourself to, it's really hard to improve that over time, right? I'm a person where I have the step counter. If I don't get that 10,000, like really bummed at the end of the day, right? I don't know what you're, measuring or managing in your personal life where you could.
I'm a swimmer, so my step counts are really small, but
maybe you're
I'm getting them there somehow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, benchmarks will move, your process will, and your goals will move, but it's awareness of the benchmarks that are really important, right? What does good look like? And we often hear this from our customers or people that are pursuing, maybe they're new to an organization, they're responsible for the ML review process, and they're just like, what does even good look like? What should I be striving for? And so benchmarks can be incredibly helpful here, right? What does good look like? And then you compare it to your own metrics and your own process to say, are we close? Are we pretty far off? Okay, we're far off, and why might that be? And I will say that, just because you're not at benchmark doesn't mean your process is failing. There could be a whole host of reasons why your process looks different than the benchmark, but it's still something to compare to and to have as a data point to sort of compare and contrast your own process. And so one thing we do at Vodori is release a benchmarks report every year. It's coming out in October of this year, where we take a look at benchmarks across the process. What is the average review time? What are the average number of circulations content goes through? By department, what is the average amount of days that the medical reviewer is taking on reviewing a piece of content? What do review times look like by content type? What does a website review look like compared to a digital sales aid? So whole host of information and data that organizations can use to just vet their process, compare their process, and maybe even set goals around it to say, wow, we're wildly off. It's taking us 6 months to review and approve content. We know the benchmark is closer to 2 weeks. Let's have a conversation around that, right? What could we potentially be doing to improve how the process works? And so benchmarks are good for awareness. They're also what's going to help drive sort of that continuous iteration and improvement of your process because you do have a goal or something you're striving for. And so we have always believed in this. We talk to each individual customer at Vodori about their benchmarks. We believe strongly that it's a catalyst in continuous iteration and improvement of the process. So looking forward to releasing the benchmarks report this year. Like I said, it's coming out in October. You can you'll be able to download the report at Vodori.com. Please do so. It's a really amazing report that we're super proud of every year, and really provides a great conversation starter at organizations around like their process, how it's going. It can just be a really good like level setting and, like I said, conversation starter to see if your process is where you want it to be.
Yeah, if the people that I think are listening to my podcast are listening to my podcast, I'd be very curious about that. I mean, if I could have had that back in the day when I was a Marcom manager, I don't feel like we had a huge problem. I mean, we did have sort of a system that would tell us when it was submitted and so on. And I think we got things through pretty quickly, but I'd be really curious. And certainly if things aren't going the way I'd like them to, it'd be nice to see how fast other people can do it. So that will be awesome. Tell us a little bit, and of course, I'll put a link to Vodori.com and your LinkedIn in the show notes, but tell us about, if you have a minute, your podcast, Amend and Progress.
I'd be delighted. Yes, Vodori has a podcast called Amend and Progress. The focus is bringing on internal experts at Vodori and also external subject matter experts to just talk about material review and content management, and just working on improving it like 1% a day. Like, what are some best practices? What are people seeing within industry? What's working? What are trends? It's really just a conversation intended to help organizations improve this process, because we do know it is so hard, but it is ever changing as well. And so that's really the goal. We release episodes every other week. It's been a delight just to have conversations with folks all across the industry to sort of unpack this necessary evil of MLR review and talk about ways that organizations can just think about the process, improve it, iterate over time. Lots of great actionable insights and best practices that come out of every episode.
I want to commend you on that. I mean, one, for doing it. I'm sure it's helpful, and point out to everybody else, like, if you thought there is no niche that is too small for a podcast, right?
Truly.
I hope you take that in the spirit it's intended, but you're having valuable conversations with people about something other people struggle with. That's all a podcast needs to be.
Yeah.
Right.
And we'll talk about, I mean, I think we've talked about anything from literally, as I talked about here, review meetings, how to run a review meeting, best practices, what you should be considering, all the way to thinking about how, AI being the big buzzy word, today, how that's going to be fitting into material review, how we anticipate some of this showing up. And so it's both some really focused, localized conversations, but also we're trying to tap into some of the bigger trends and things that we're seeing. But yeah, it's been a total delight, honestly. And we're having a lot of fun with it. And hopefully folks are getting some education and best practices out of it as well. That's the goal.
I have no doubt. Annalise Ludtke, thank you so much for this. This has been a blast.
Thank you so much, Chris. Delighted to be here. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Hey, if you're still listening, that tells me you enjoyed the podcast. But don't tell me, tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Okay, you can tell me too. Send an email, chris@lifesciencemarketingradio.com. Bye-bye.